Good afternoon, everybody, on not only a Friday, and we've nearly survived the whole of February now, but also Valentine's Day. So thank you very, very much all for coming today to Love in Action, How Citizen Science Connects Passion and Purpose with John Findlay, who I have the pleasure of being joined with this afternoon. Just a bit of housekeeping as usual. The call is recorded so that people can watch it back later on. I know there's only a few of you in the room at the moment, so there's bound to be some more dings in a minute or two, so we'll give it probably another 1 minute or so to let anybody else in, and then I will be handing over to John. So if you want to keep your cameras off, more than welcome to do so. But if later on, if you've got any questions and you're feeling brave enough, do turn your camera on and then we can have a nice chat. Otherwise, if you prefer to put your questions in the chat function instead, then I can obviously read them out on your behalf. So yeah, sit back and relax on this Valentine's Day. Apart from you, John. I mean, you and I are working, but I think something operationally must have kicked off today because there's supposed to be a lot of IWater people on, and we've got Nicola in at the moment, haven't we, Nicola? Say hi.
I was looking for my unmute. Afternoon all. We're here.
Super, thank you. We'll give it until it turns 4 minutes past and then we'll kick off. So just watch. As soon as I hand over to you, John, it'll go ding again, won't it?
But it's got to.
So anyway, I'll hand you all over. How Citizen Science Connects Passion with Purpose. Over to you, John, for a bit of an intro.
Okay, yep. So good afternoon. I'm John Findlay, and I'm the Citizen Science Coordinator for East Anglia. I sit within the Environment Agency's Analysis and Reporting team, which undertakes plant and habitat surveys, analyses invertebrate samples and reports on ecology, chemistry and fish data. And I work specifically within the Supporting Citizen Science project, looking at how we can help citizen scientists to collect good quality data and use this to drive environmental outcomes. And I'll just say, if you have any questions during the presentation, if you let Claire know, and then she can stop me at the end of the slide. Otherwise, I'm very happy to take any less pressing questions at the end. And with that, I'll pass across to Claire for the to introduce the sponsors.
Thank you, John. So yes, as usual, we are utterly spoiled in the Eastern area with the amount of sponsors that we've got, and we are very, very grateful for their support. Our sponsors this year for 2025 are Claret Civil Engineering, Love Every Drop, so my company that I work for, IWater, Merit Skills, AC Contracting Group, Clancy, Kia, RSE, and Windmill Insight Solutions. So thank you to all of those for financial and moral support for all our events over the year. So without further ado, let's start our Citizen Science Valentine's Day.
Brilliant, thank you, Claire. So I'll just briefly run through what I'm going to be talking about. So I'll be talking about who citizen scientists are, what they monitor, why, in my view, we should engage with them, and why we should use their data, because they are slightly different things. I'll be talking about the quality of citizen science data, and then I'll go through some examples of the successes we've had using citizen science data, and then I'll briefly mention the future, acknowledge the groups I've been working with, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions. So, who are citizen scientists? Well, nearly anybody. Essentially, any volunteer who undertakes environmental monitoring to generate data. So they come from all walks of life. A lot of them are retired, but you also get people of a full range of ages looking to be involved in protecting their local rivers or just looking for community activities. Most are part of existing groups, such as wildlife trusts and rivers trusts, but quite a lot also operate on their own or form new groups. And what do they monitor? Well, in my notes for this slide, I've put almost everything. So the most common things are chemical water quality data by various means, everything from test strips to handheld photometers to sending samples off to laboratories for testing. And again, invertebrates, both bankside schemes like Riverfly and schemes like Smart Rivers. And again, in some cases, they will also send some to laboratories. But schemes also exist for monitoring outfalls, missed connections, sediment inputs, morphology, so the structures of the channels, and a number of them are also interested in monitoring E. coli. Why should we engage with them? Well, I've covered it under these 5 headings, but I will say a little bit more about each. So, local knowledge. Local people almost always know their rivers better than we do, from which pool fish hang out in, to which of the drainage ditches look a bit dodgy. There's a lot that they know that we don't tend to, and can't necessarily know purely from our data. There's only so small a level we can go with our monitoring. There's only so many places we can monitor, and there's only so many places we can justify monitoring unless somebody says, you want to go and have a look there. Legitimate concerns. So people are normally correct when they think that something isn't right. It might not be illegal, it might be natural, it might be a drought, it might be saline ingress. Some of these things do happen naturally, but a lot of the time when something doesn't look right, either it's a problem or there's a good reason why somebody might think it looks like a problem. Similarly, if swimmers are getting sick, it isn't necessarily E. coli. Even if it is, it didn't necessarily come from a sewage works. And even if it did, it isn't necessarily criminal. But again, it's reason. What I'm saying here is essentially there are normally good reasons why people are concerned. Sometimes we need to explain, and so it's not necessarily anything criminal or wrong. But normally, when somebody has a concern, there's a reason why they're concerned, and it's justifiable that they at least want to understand what is happening. So from that sort of leads on to the reputational benefits side of things. Most citizen scientists do really care, and they do just want to know what's going on. So just being there and taking them seriously can actually produce huge reputational benefits. You go out, you talk to people, and they say, oh, so your organisation does care, you do pay attention to us, you do care what we have to say. And yeah, just that being there, just that listening makes a massive difference to how you are perceived and how your organisation is perceived. And then building understanding. Again, rivers are complex, and so is interpreting data about them. So if people understand what their data means, what we want them to report, and what they don't need to report to us, we work better together and we deliver more for the environment. We spend our time investigating the things that we need to investigate, and then they spend less time getting frustrated that we're not acting, and more time, and we can produce more of the sort of positive case studies that you'll see later on, examples of where citizen scientists have highlighted things that we wouldn't have found otherwise, and we've been able to take action accordingly. And then improve data quality. So essentially, if people know what they're monitoring and reporting, how they can gather data that we can use, again, effectively, again, it means we spend less time effectively giving people the message they don't want to hear, which is, I'm sorry, there's nothing awful lot we can do with that. So why should we use citizen science data? Well, the first and one of the most important points about citizen science data is the coverage and the frequency that's possible. So this map, which you can hopefully see, shows the River Wensum, and this is the citizen science monitoring on the Wensum. The Wensum is well monitored by the Environment Agency. It's one of the rivers where we have quite a high density of monitoring, but we cannot monitor at anything like this frequency across. We can't monitor anything like this density, I should say, across a catchment. A lot of these points are being monitored weekly. It's a phenomenal amount of effort. It's lots and lots of individual volunteers going out and monitoring a site or two once a week or once a fortnight, and that's just the volume of effort is just something that professionals in the water industry, that as professionals we simply can't match. We can do very good monitoring, if we need to, we can do very regular monitoring of a few points, but we can't monitor that many points that regularly across the areas we cover. It's just not possible. Again, local knowledge and access. So in a lot of cases, these monitoring points are driven by local people knowing where they think there might be problems. In some cases, they might find the evidence that actually there isn't a problem. In some cases, they'll find the evidence there is, and that might just give us the ability to act. Similarly, the access side of things, local people sometimes know landowners, local people sometimes have relationships with landowners, local people can sometimes get places that we can't practically get unless we have proof that there's a problem, because local people might have relationships with people who don't want anything to do with the Environment Agency, don't want anything to do with the water companies. But again, being able to gather that data can be very helpful. And then there's also the fact that citizen scientists are putting a lot of time and effort into gathering this data. We owe it to them to at least take a look, to at least see what we can do with it. So, quality. We do all have horror stories. I'm sure everybody who's worked with citizen science has seen some bad data. I'm not going to list off loads of these stories here. I've got a few, but the horror stories shouldn't be taken to be representative. They do exist. I will say something about the point regarding the need for support and training, though. Citizen scientists aren't stupid. We shouldn't underestimate them, but they come from all walks of life, so most of them are not experts in fields like water chemistry, river morphology, and vertebrate identification. A few are, and we also need to recognise that. But for argument's sake, imagine if I asked anyone from our accountants to our cleaners to our senior managers to collect and analyse the sort of data we work with from a site local to their home. A tiny number in each group might do it as well or better than us. Quite a lot would do a reasonable job, potentially even adding information that we didn't know from their local knowledge, but they'd also miss things that seem obvious to us as experts, and quite a lot wouldn't know where to begin. Assuming nothing about an individual, I would say the safest thing is to assume nothing about an individual, but assume that most groups will have something interesting to tell you about their local river and will need some help with at least one technical aspect of water quality monitoring. So, I will now mention a few common problems and solutions. So, unless volunteers, so starting with the zeros, the impossible and max or overmax values. So unless volunteers record in their notes why they've recorded these values, they're very difficult to use because they're intrinsically unreliable. Does a zero mean that no sample was taken? Does it mean that there was actually that they were very able to take a sample and their equipment read zero? Similarly, a lot of meters read a maximum value at or over that level. They might flash if the value's over, but again, if they're not recording it, you don't know which has happened. So it's really important to have automated forms and checks, if you can, to prompt people if they try and enter a maximum value or a zero to say, hang on a moment, is this really what's happening? Next point, where I've got lots of, where I've got lists of the different forms of ammoniacal nitrogen, the different forms of phosphate. This is just to say conversions aren't necessarily simple, and the explanations in the meter manufacturers' handbooks aren't always helpful. So you quite frequently see phrases like, to convert the reading 2 parts per million of ammonia, multiply by 1.214. That's technically correct after you've added a vial of strongly alkaline reagent to river water, but it's not representative of the conditions in the river beforehand, where you'd have an equilibrium in which very likely the vast majority of the ammoniacal nitrogen would be in the form of ammonium, not ammonia. So I would also say, rather than asking volunteers to perform these conversions themselves, ask the volunteer lead to ensure that the conversions are built into the data capture system. And similarly, if you're giving volunteers thresholds for action, if you're giving volunteers thresholds to come to you, to report something to you, to say something to you, base those on the readings on their meters. Don't make them perform conversions, because again, it just adds potential for mistakes, and adds potential for mistakes that we don't need. Often you have to start by training volunteer coordinators. they're talented and undervalued people with difficult jobs, but they're not necessarily specialist water chemists or specialist invertebrate analysts. So I've just said all that. Let's ask the flip side. How good can citizen science data be? Incidentally, this elephant's trunk looks a bit like a question mark. It also, for a moment of Valentine's theme, looks a bit like half a heart. I couldn't find a picture of the two elephants' trunks coming together to form the full heart shape, but that would perhaps have been ideal for today. Anyway, so these next few slides are looking at cheap handheld photometers which claim high accuracy, volunteers who've been trained by professionals and are provided with clear manuals, and then the question here is, how good can the data be? Well, the phosphate data correlates very well. So this was from a bit earlier on in the project. So this was from 2023, and we compared Wentham citizen science volunteers, a group managed by a coordinator and Norfolk Rivers Trust, using low-range phosphate checkers against University of East Anglia and Environment Agency lab data, and supported by the Ofwat-funded CASTCO, which is Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative. And if you look at the graphs, you can see that actually the correlations look pretty good. So you can see on the left-hand side, we've got the University of East Anglia lab data, and on the right-hand side, we've got a smaller sample comparing to Environment Agency lab data. And as I say, in both cases, the correlations look pretty good. These are both phosphate. We repeated the exercise with most of the same partners, but on the River Lark in 2024, with in this case working with the River Lark Catchment Partnership as well. And again, you can see the correlation looks pretty good. What we didn't get much useful information from the Wentham volunteers was ammonia meters. This was largely because, and it's a nice problem to have, the ammonia levels at most of the Wentham sites were just too low. However, on the River Lark, the ammonia levels were a bit higher, and so we were able to look at it a bit more. And in this context, you can see that at higher values, you get a pretty good idea. It certainly gives you a good idea if ammoniacal nitrogen levels might be reaching the sort of levels at which they might pose an acute risk to invertebrate and fish communities. However, at lower levels, the correlation does seem to break down a bit. So building on that work, we then looked to find an affordable way for citizen science to perform ongoing regular quality control on citizen science data. This is very recent work, so we've not quite got there yet, but as you can see on this slide, the broad outline of the process is obtain low-cost colourless standard solutions, distribute these for testing. We also sent the first batch to our lab at the Environment Agency to make sure that the standards were what they said they were. The concentration of the solutions isn't shared with citizen scientists, so we can test both their technique and the meter accuracy, and then they submit the form, and then they submitted the results in a standard form. Again, this was conducted with the volunteer coordinator at the Norfolk Rivers Trust, who actually sent out the instructions and received the standard forms back from the volunteers. This was the first time we'd done it, but it worked well as a trial. It's possible to follow up with volunteers where they don't get results within the expected range. So, for instance, we found out that some of the volunteers hadn't replaced the batteries recently enough in their meters, and that accounted for some of the unexpectedly high results. This initial trial took place in the Lark, Wentham, Cam, and Waveney. Also pointed to the need to do more to standardise the temperature and the testing methods for the ammonia meter, where the instructions aren't quite as prescriptive as they probably should be. So the quality can be good. So what can we do with the data? So this is probably the first example. So the tap, which is a tributary of the Wensum, had very high phosphate levels downstream of a pipe. It was reported by the citizen science volunteer to their coordinator, who then passed the report on to us. A letter was sent by our land and water team to the responsible partner, who took action both to service their private sewage system and committed to servicing it more frequently in the future. And as you can see, if you look at the graph, and apologies for the fact it's a little bit small, but you can see quite clearly that after the report, phosphate levels come down and they stay down. And the crucial thing to say here is this is not something that we'd have been likely to detect without a volunteer. This was a small pipe from a private sewage system draining onto the bed of a small ditch. The high phosphate levels only appeared when you got flow in the ditch, which wasn't at all times. And whilst it's possible that, and whilst it's likely that this phosphate source was part of a cause of was a partial cause of elevated phosphate levels at the site downstream, we'd never have known from our monitoring point where it was downstream that this was a factor in the high phosphate levels at that point. This work also led to the development of an automated pollution reporting tool for volunteers in the Wensum to share their data, photos, etc., directly with their coordinators and our land and water teams when reporting a pollution incident. So it's been an important piece of early work. It demonstrated really nicely that essentially volunteer data can be really key in both finding problems and enabling us to test whether or not they've been fixed. Okay, so this is another quite nice story. This was detected by volunteers literally on the afternoon of the morning after their training. This is actually a high range ammonia meter, so you can see that that's a phenomenal amount of ammoniacal nitrogen there. First incident, we followed up on it the same day. Again, because of all that data validation stuff we'd done earlier, we were confident that we could follow it up on it on the same day. It wasn't initially tested with a high range meter. It was initially tested with a mid-range meter and went straight over range. Remedial action has been taken. Again, the area is still being monitored by the citizen scientists. And in this case, I won't be saying all that much more because there's a potential for legal action. And 2 further sites on a different tributary of the River Lark, this time high phosphate levels. Again, ongoing monitoring, potential for an EA investigation next year. And again, these are places that we simply wouldn't have found without citizen science volunteers monitoring. So, what about the invertebrates? Well, most of what I will be talking about will be the river flow scheme. So, it's invertebrate identification by volunteers trained to monitor for evidence of pollution and other incidents. It's one of the biggest freshwater monitoring schemes nationally. You can see from this picture just how many sites there are. And just to say, the image here is from the website and it's included purely to demonstrate the extent of the monitoring. So, Riverfly involves volunteers identifying 8 key groups of invertebrates, each of which scores 1 to 4 depending on its abundance, or 0 if it's not present at all. A trigger level is set by the local Environment Agency coordinator. For East Anglia, that's me. And a breach is and when volunteers think they've breached that trigger level, so they've got a lower score, they repeat their sample. If their repeat is also below the trigger level, they'll then report it to myself and our incident hotline. The standard scheme is intended to detect acute environmental incidents that cause harm to the invertebrate community. So, because it's only 8 groups, it's something that that volunteers can be trained in one day, and it enables volunteers to detect and warn us about environmental incidents. Some of the groups in the standard scheme are quite broad, so it enables us to tell that there has been an incident. A breach doesn't necessarily enable us to tell what the incident has been, what caused the incident. As such, it does require a follow-up investigation, or the use, or that the citizen science groups use a more advanced scheme such as extended river flow or smart rivers, which unfortunately can't be trained in a single day, in order to get more understanding of the pressure. And I should say here, a trigger level is the normal level for a site in its normal condition. So it's not the same thing as a target or a reflection of what the site should be like in its natural state. It's very much set to determine if there's an acute incident that causes something new to go wrong at a site. So what have we done with river flow data? Well, we've detected drought with river flow data. So there was a breach in 2019 reported to me by Ian Hawkins, who deserves a great deal of credit for his role in Riverfly in East Anglia. He was both the trainer and the coordinator for the vast majority of the groups in East Anglia in the time he was working, which was up to mid-2020s before he moved in, up to I think probably 2021, 2022 when he moved out of the area. So anyway, he reported an incident in 2019. I investigated this and didn't find any clear indication of pollution. Under normal circumstances, the site in question, which was Hengrave on the River Lark, has run pool flow types and can support a wide range of invertebrates. However, the site does appear to be especially sensitive to drought impacts because it's open, wide, shallow. It's downstream of the sewage works, so it often receives fairly low levels of nutrient and sediment-enriched water, with nutrients likely to become more concentrated during periods of low flow. And these factors make it prone to becoming covered with algae, plants, and fine sediment during prolonged dry weather and drought. The graph there shows the scores at the site between 2018 and today. And following that information, not only did we pick up on the fact that there was a drought, we were then able to use riverflow data from elsewhere to expand the number of places where we knew there were drought impacts. So as you can see there, it also enabled us to detect drought impacts on the Little Ouse. The Hengrave site was also returned to our drought network. It had been removed a few years previously, this is to say the Environment Agency's drought monitoring network, because signal crayfish impacts had made it an unreliable indicator of drought. But this work helped show us that actually it was responding more predictably again, albeit with a new higher, albeit at a new higher level because of the impact that signal crayfish have on invertebrate communities, which I won't go into here. I can explain that afterwards if people need me to. Riverflow data thereby, so during the 2022 drought, we again observed impacts on the River Lark and also on the River Granta, which is a tributary of the Cam. Again, these are places where we wouldn't have found drought impacts without the aid of Riverflow volunteers. And in each case, I was essentially able to pass this information alongside EA data to our area drought groups, who were then able to use it to help inform how we responded to drought. So when we enter and leave drought, which catchments are affected by drought, etc. Again, just to thank I'll just do a few acknowledgements at this stage because these are in a lot of cases individuals or groups for whom I don't have logos at the end. So just to thank Ian Hawkins, the Thetford River Group, Little Ouse Headwaters Project, Abingdon Nature Watch, and Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire Wildlife Trust for their involvement in the riverfly work of this sort. So, sustaining and expanding riverfly. So as I've alluded to previously, the coordinator and trainer for the area moved on. There were some new trainers in Norfolk, but not elsewhere. So before the trainer moved on, I trained myself as a riverfly accreditation trainer. And then I was able to offer extra training courses to new riverfly groups who were looking to get trainers signed off. And that enabled us to get new riverfly trainers in the Upper and Bedford Ouse Catchment Partnership, which then means that the scheme can be sustained without me having to train every single new river flag group, which would unfortunately not have been long-term sustainable. Or safari. So this is a means for volunteers to report and categorise outfalls. Some of you may already have heard of it. It's very successful in London, accounting for over half of the reports that Thames Water receives of problems with their network. It's far less developed elsewhere, but we are trying to roll it out in East Anglia, and it is also being rolled out elsewhere via Train the Trainer events for volunteer leads through the Cast Code project. Reports go to water companies for them to trace, and also come to the EA if they're severe, or if the water company looks at them and confirms that they're not responsible. So we have one success here from an outfall into the Ouzel in, I should say in Leighton Buzzard, not on Leighton Buzzard, sorry. Again, this was something that could only have been found by volunteers. And again, volunteer monitoring was important to check for repeat issues. And had been found at the point at which the case study that I've included opposite took place. Other schemes, so MudSpotter, which is a scheme focused on finding sediment sources and then categorizing them by size, type, and turbidity. Citizen, RHS, and Morph are physical habitat surveys. Both have fairly extensive coverage and can help target habitat restoration work. And Morph and MudSpotter are again being rolled out at Train the Trainer events. All of the aforementioned surveys have considerable potential, which hopefully we'll be able to explore in the future. Cue my next slide. So the future, well, we're hoping to see greater use of citizen science in weight of evidence, with citizen science data weighted according to its tier. So we can not just use citizen science data, but we can use it appropriately based on the amount of quality control, its relevance to the question, etc. We're exploring using citizen science data to improve model, or we're hoping to explore using citizen science data to improve models, more cooperative use of citizen science data in project planning, explore the potential of other schemes and other monitoring methods, and further develop dashboards and the pollution reporting tool and roll them out more widely. So, acknowledgements. So I'd like to thank all the partners in this project. So Norfolk Rivers Trust, the Rivers Trust nationally, the Camanili Use Catchment Partnership, Cam Valley Forum, Waverley Rivers Trust, Wensum Catchment Partnership, Citizen Science Volunteers, River Lark Catchment Partnership, Broadland Catchment Partnership, Wensum Catchment Partnership, Anglian Water, Zoological Society of London, Green Sands Trust, Up and Bedford Use Catchment Partnership, and Castco, and also anyone else who I have forgotten has my sincerest apologies at this stage. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and ask if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. It's not an area that I know an awful, or before now knew an awful lot about. So have you always done this, John, in the Environment Agency, or have you had other careers within the agency?
No, the Supporting Citizen Science project started in, I think, maybe July 2022. I was recruited into this position in August 2022. Before that, I worked in the same team, but mostly on the invertebrate analysis side of things. I was involved in the riverfly scheme, so some of the work about drought predates my recruitment into the citizen science position. But before that, otherwise I was very much focused on invertebrates, plants, habitat, and a little bit of chemistry and fish work.
Excellent. Has anyone on the call today ever been involved with citizen science themselves? Are you going to say something, Claire? Everyone's too shy, John. Oh, we've got a question in the chat though. Nicola's written, do you get a good correlation between the handheld kits and the lab data?
So the answer to yes, just I'm still sharing my screen, aren't I? So you can see that. So the answer to that question is very definitely yes, although with the caveat that all this all this correlative data and all this correlative work I've done is based on a couple of groups who do have professional coordinators in place who are going after their work. So these are groups that, as it were, are examples of the best. So they are groups, as I say, with professional coordinators, with well-written manuals that I've vetted, etc. I haven't looked at the wider. I haven't looked at what happens if you look at sort of volunteers where these things aren't the case to the same extent. Partly because those groups are almost by definition harder to work with, because it's harder to get lots of people at the same time, at the same place, etc.
And then Cara from South Staffs has said that it's really interesting to hear about citizen science. She's never been involved, but how do you make more people aware of these careers?
So in terms of the careers, at the moment, I don't think there are. At the moment, I don't think there are a huge number. There are sort of volunteer management coordinator type positions at a few of the rivers trusts, and then there are I think 14 part or full-time positions at the Environment Agency. I believe possibly some of the water companies and wildlife trusts also have corresponding positions, but at the moment I haven't. Yeah, at the moment, to be honest, I haven't done a great deal to sort of advertise this as a career option for people. But it's a good question, and it is something we probably do need to be thinking about.
And then Andrew has asked, have the EA used citizen data to drive local campaigns such as inspections on private discharges to see if meeting permits or targeted farm inspections?
So we have had there have been one or two farm inspections off the back of reports from citizen scientists. However, on the whole, a lot of the groups behind these things prefer to try and get their farm advisors out because effectively getting citizen scientists onto people's land is contingent upon cooperative working with landowners. So on the whole, they prefer to operate through farm advice first, and only resorting to our involvement if getting either their own farm advisors, Natural England farm advisors, or Environment Agency farm advisors out doesn't result in the desired outcome.
Perfect. Yeah.
When it comes to again, in terms of targeted campaigns focusing on private sewage outfalls, we haven't had a targeted campaign in East Anglia yet, to my knowledge. So far, what we've had has just been these cases where effectively volunteers have found things. They've contacted our land and water team. Our land and water team have written letters to those responsible, and then those responsible have taken appropriate remedial action, and we've been able to verify that that's had the desired effect from the ongoing citizen science monitoring. But certainly that is something for the future, and certainly that is something that might have happened elsewhere. I will say here, this is what I've presented on is the scope of what's happened in East Anglia. I do have 14 counterparts around the country who are probably, and most of them will probably be ahead of me in some areas and behind me in others. So they'll have, some of them may have already got to that stage. Others probably haven't got as far as we have in East Anglia. So just, yeah, it depends on the areas. But yeah, that is something I could envision happening in the future.
Thank you.
Been a really interesting afternoon. Has anyone else got any questions before we wrap up? And yes, we do. Claire apologised. Her camera doesn't seem to be wanting to play ball on a Friday. It's clearly obviously had enough of the working week. She's curious to know how suppliers can support your handheld instrument needs through training, accuracy of data, etc. Because HAC have some testing kits in some regions, but have lost contact once distributed into the field, and that's something that she'd be happy to support.
I mean, I personally, as working for the Environment Agency, I'm slightly limited as to what I can do to endorse or not. What I would say is, and what I can do to what I can say, but what I would say on that front is probably listen to the volunteers and their local coordinators. So the coordinators at the wildlife trusts, the coordinators at the rivers trusts, etc. Listen to what they are asking for, potentially engage with them directly, because they are the ones with most of the purchasing power. I engage through these people with citizen scientists for the most part. I don't directly manage citizen scientists myself, so I'm trying to think what other advice I could give. Yeah, I would say engage with them, particularly if they are asking for things or they are reporting problems. Try and engage with them. Don't assume that people will necessarily understand some of the terms in guidance. So particularly those points around phosphate as P, total P, are often challenging for volunteers, particularly those with no background in chemistry. And the same goes with ammoniacal nitrogen. So make those things really clear, and similarly think about making just make all aspects of any instructions provided as clear as possible. And the other thing is, I think if you've got contacts with group leads, do get back in touch. Do indicate that you'd be interested to stay in touch with them, because the group leads are the group leads are keen to stay in touch. I think a lot of the group leads are keen to stay in touch. I think they do want to work with suppliers. It's just a case of don't be afraid to email them. Don't be afraid to offer them new products to try. They are keen to test things out. But the other thing is, I would say, try and focus probably towards the lower cost end of the market. Try and focus on low cost and accurate, I think, are probably the two main concerns. The other thing that perhaps would be helpful for these groups would be guidance on disposal or that sort of side of things. Obviously, what in an ideal world perhaps these groups would want would be stuff that's low cost, accurate, and completely safe. But that gets difficult. So in some cases, just guidance on what safe disposal instructions would be, again, would probably be helpful to the coordinators for these groups, just because, again, in a lot of cases, they're specialists in engagement with volunteers, not necessarily specialist chemists.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, John. We really appreciate your time this afternoon. I've got to go away and do some more research now, because this has got me very, very interested. I'm quite tempted to go and see if I can do at least a tender day and see what happens. So really, really thank you ever so much. I know there'll be lots of people watching back. If anyone thinks of any questions after we close the webinar today, just drop me a line. You've all got my email, and I can make sure it gets forwarded on to John. But in the meantime, I wish you all a wonderful Friday. Happy Valentine's Day to you all. And thank you once again, John, for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.